Portugal is an old colonial empire, perhaps the first of its kind, and while it fell from glory a long ago, it is clinging to its last vestiges like a wounded animal to its pride. Of course, this is the world of Kaiserreich and not our timeline. In the world of Kaiserreich, minor powers must often punch above their weight if they wish to survive. Portugal is definitely no exception to this rule. For centuries, this country has prospered under an alliance with Britain, first England. However, this nation was consumed in the fires of the Weltkrieg and the Revolution, and now Portugal is orphaned of its major ally. Lacking the once plentiful trade, the country stares down economic crisis and political crisis. Its fledgling democracy having been replaced first with a monarchy and then with radical forces that plan to restore its old glory and empire. Of course, lacking the industry and the population to stand up to Europe's great powers, Portugal must look to other lands, the virgin lands of Africa, if it wishes to continue its glory, and bring to this land, like it did once ago, the civilization that has always characterized this great nation. Only there can Portugal really find the resources required to make it into Europe's big leagues. Welcome back, everyone, to another Kaiserreich country overview, and as you know, this time it will be Portugal. Now, Portugal is very interesting. As I've already said in the introduction, it is a very minor country in a very, very bad situation. The focus tree is large, but we'll get to that soon enough. First, we're going to take a look at what the army looks like. The army is only 3 infantry divisions with, of course, 9 battalions each, and then 2 garrisons, one in Mozambique and one in Angola. As you know, Portugal is a colonial power by vocation. In Europe, it's basically faced with enemies and more enemies, and yet more enemies. It does have, however, some opportunities for expansion in Africa, where it is faced with Dutch Middle Africa. To do that, well, you need to build up your army, because there's going to be conflicts with Middle Africa over your border areas. You have various different ways for events of destabilizing Middle Africa. However, if you're not careful, Middle Africa might just decide to come after you, and at the start, they are much stronger than you are, so you need to be careful. Your navy isn't anything to really write home about, only 8 destroyers and 4 submarines, but you can expand that fairly quickly, and you only have 25 tactical bombers. Of course, you do have the option of allying with the Entente later on, as that is basically Portugal's traditional partner, being the British monarchy. And from that, you can essentially get enough allies to start actually influencing parts of the world. Of course, you don't only have territory in Africa, you also have a colony in India, Goa, and you also have some in West Africa, Guinea, but mainly you are confined with the African theater. Later on, you can also influence events in Iberia because of the Spanish Civil War. You also have a tiny claim, Oldenza, in Spain, which you can reclaim during the Civil War. And all of that is fed by the national focus tree. Now, the national focus tree for Portugal is very, very big. Stop that. Is very, very big. I'm gonna list right now the amount of bonuses that you get from each military tree, because the military trees are very, very expansive. Essentially, you get a lot of bonuses for research, and then a lot of modifiers that help you out in one way or another, mostly in terms of cavalry, division, recovery time, etc., etc. With the Navy, you are going to have to pick between 2 capital ship or screens, listing those things as well. And with the Air Force, is pretty standard. What's more interesting is the fact that the Navy tree actually heads down to a lot of colonial focuses that in some way affect your economy. Your economy at the start is not that great. You only have 2 military factories, 1 dockyard, and 9 civilian factories. However, you can expand that through you know, your economy branch, which also deals with how Black Monday is going to be hitting you. And also, of course, the Colonial Tree, which is pretty interesting for Portugal because it kind of relies on you trying to cling to your overseas territories to actually gain full strength. Because otherwise, you're going to be lacking a part of your national focus tree. You can't really just give up those territories. And that's kind of what I like about Portugal overall in Kaiserreich, because you're very much going to be essentially driven towards the colonial game, trying to fight up against Middle Africa, trying to reclaim some territories in Africa that you perhaps would want, of course, from the pink map focus, which would be all the territory that Portugal tried to claim in the 1800s to connect up Mozambique and Angola. You're also going to have some beefs to play with, of course, Germany and South Africa, and perhaps the Indians if they so decide to, well, reclaim your tiny little enclave. And basically, the rest of the national focus tree deals with integralism and the king. Now, we kind of have to understand what integralism is in order to understand the kind of government that we're under. And integralism is a national populist ideology in Kaiserreich, of course. They are far right. They have basically been elected in Portugal first, but at this point they basically have a dictatorship set up. What integralism essentially states is that nations are an organic whole. So basically the history, the culture, and also the regional particularities of each nation will determine the best the best state forms and the best state policies. So because of that, the state is basically elevated to a role of a moral good, from what I've read, essentially becoming both a state in a normal sense and also sort of the expression of the nation as a whole, and also of the religion. So it also has religious connotation. It's got corporatist connotations. So basically trying to integrate the biggest financial, economic concerns and trusts into the state rather than trying to regulate them from the outside. And of course, it tries to preach class cooperation to try to keep the lower classes in line with sort of the national spirit again. And basically, the end result is that what it tries to do is it tries to create a sort of national spirit that is unique to each nation. Now, in our timeline, I believe, so in our timeline, integralism took hold in Brazil, a little bit in Portugal, and some in some Western countries, for example. I believe integralism was actually invented by Action Française, which was one of the first real far-right, I believe also anti-Semitic organizations in Europe. Of course, it was in France. And some aspects were also then taken by fascism and National Socialism. For example, you may have heard of the concept of Volksgemeinschaft for Nazism and also for Imperial German ideology. And that was basically the same thing as the organic nation concept of integralism. And of course, Brazil can also go integralist in the Kaiserreich. Unfortunately, I don't think you can have an alliance between integralist Portugal and integralist Brazil, which is kind of sad. But yes, that is basically the ideology. And part of the national focus tree that deals with politics is split into two sides. Either you side with the integralists or with the monarchy being the other sort of unifying force for Portugal right now. I'm going to list the bonuses right now on the screen. What's interesting about these two is that they're basically doing the same thing differently. The integralists are more looking towards trying to build a whole national consciousness, and they're very militaristic. So, for example, you can see that they have a lot of military bonuses, whereas the king uses more, I guess you could say, traditional methods. He's less of a fascist and more of an absolute monarch. So he imprisons his political opponents, he issues edicts, and then tries to build sort of the monarchy as the whole basis of society, whereas the integralists are more just about establishing their own rule over the country and then expanding outward, trying to grab themselves as much territory abroad as possible. It's interesting how also that a nation like this gets in bed with the Entente. So, of course, the Entente tries to portray itself as the bastion of liberal democracy, and yet you have Portugal, this kind of little tiny insane country that tries to expand and has a very, very, in some ways, radical ideology that can kind of just ally up with them. And it's also kind of conflicting with the interests of India sometimes, but overall, the Entente will help you out in Africa because nobody really here has that many interests in trying to take out Middle Africa except you. Well, of course, the French. So you do have some conflicting interests with other Entente members, but overall, the alliance works because of its sort of historical callbacks to the I believe it's a 14th century alliance between Portugal and Britain. And then, of course, that makes you, in the late game, into the Entente sort of springboard into Europe, because you are a very nice foothold for the Entente to hold. It also kind of exposes you to the attacks of the Union of Britain and the German Empire by sea. They do like to naval invade you, so you need to be very careful about your coastlines and how you protect them. But you can become very, very strong in the late game, considering your sort of low population pool, and then also, because of that, your small army. You can get quite a lot of interest together all throughout the world. Like, you can intervene basically everywhere, and that's what I like about Portugal, especially because the navy tree is very expansive, and because you're allied with the Entente, who are basically the premier naval powers around. It affords you a lot more freedom than in some other countries that even nominally are much stronger. For example, the Ottomans or something. You have a lot more options to spread around the world, and because the Entente is such a diverse sort of alliance, it's kind of interesting also how you can find yourself fighting alongside the Indians in Persia or something. And then 2 years later, you're helping out the Canadians retake the Union of Britain. And it's because of that, it's very fun, because you can get yourself involved into a lot of different, as I said, a lot of different conflicts. And so have a lot more variety over places where you're fighting, enemies, etc., etc. That's basically about it. You may or may not remember that I streamed Portugal quite a while ago. A link to that VOD will be in the description, of course. As always, I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this country breakdown. If you have enjoyed, please drop down a like, and if you want, suggest any kind of videos I could do about Kaiserreich and its lore that you may want to see. I don't know. Really, I've almost finished all of the latest updates, focuses. I mean, a few remain that I'm not really that interested in. For example, Switzerland. I will do a Norway one. Of course, also had a Norway playthrough, so I basically remember how this goes. And yeah, other than that, after I finish the Norway video, then I'll be free to do anything else. So if you have any suggestions, drop down in the comments. And yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed. I will see you soon, hopefully. And take care.